to them. So without further ado, I would like to hand on now to our first speaker, Andrzej Nowak. Andrzej works at the juncture of technology, business, and innovation. His career has taken him through CERN, Intel, and the CERN Open Lab public-private partnership before setting up his own businesses. Today, Andrzej's interests include the future of identity, privacy, and money, so all important things. His talk has the intriguing title of Making Digital Privacy Exist Again. So with that, over to you, Andrzej.
Good morning, good afternoon to all. Thank you very much for the introduction, James, and thanks for setting up this really interesting, exciting day. I will try to share my screen with you. If that doesn't work, please shout. You should be able to see it currently. And we'll be talking about how to, or what are the options for making digital privacy exist again. So my name is Andrzej. As James said, I've worked in big technology at CERN. I've worked in management consulting and finance. I've done my PhD in computer science at EPFL, and now I work in innovation management. So it's kind of a mix of different things, but it also allowed me to look at privacy and related aspects with completely different sets of lenses depending on where I was. And I'd like to share that. With you. Most importantly, I'm a person just like you, interested in privacy. Like many of you, I'm a privacy enthusiast. I came here to share some of the thoughts and observations with you, and lead into some of the more machine learning oriented topics. This will be a little bit more general, and there's nothing official about this talk, so it's personal research. It does not represent in any way the view of my employer, and it's kind of a follow-on on a wider data protection series that ran at CERN. So in the last year, I think I've delivered maybe 5 hours of talks on these topics. So if that sounds interesting, you can certainly look into the CERN archive to dig out more. So maybe we should start by defining what privacy is. And the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy will tell us that there is no single definition or analysis or meaning of the term. We use it all the time in ordinary language, in political discussions, legal, philosophical discussions, and so on. And it becomes even harder when we speak of digital, right? Because digital in itself is a word that's not very well defined. Certainly, if you go to the industry, it means a different thing that, if you go to science and so on. So the term in itself, I think, is a little bit challenging to define, even at the get-go. So I would define privacy as the ability to keep stuff to oneself. So first of all, there would be the right to be alone, a certain level of autonomy. There would be a level of control involved in this, and of course, a level of selective disclosure. So in a way, the subject would decide what they would be disclosing to other parties or not. And of course, this has enormous implications. The questions are we using encryption? Are we using passwords? Are we using curtains in our house, blinds, fences, door locks, and so on? And I think, nobody would like to show others our financial statements, medical records, and so on. So privacy is maybe not so much about secrecy as it is about control, and especially in the digital age, once it's out, right? It's out forever, and it's not able to kind of, the cat cannot get back in the bag. So we should keep that in mind, right? Many things in the digital world are permanent, regardless of what we think about them. And the lack of privacy results in a transfer of control, of power, right? It's very closely related to our agency as humans. Are we able to, determine our own actions or not? So let's take a look perhaps at, how privacy kind of looked in the old times, if we could say that, right? So really, 200,000 years ago, tribes used to live together. This comes from the studies in the 50s, so this is very well-known knowledge. Tribes used to live together, and there was a certain preference for solitude. So, of course, that would be outdoors, if it is not possible indoors. That means that privacy would be exercised in harsh conditions. Tribes still would stick together. Even today, there are tribes, for example, Inuits that used to stick together, and then a desire to be alone is almost considered to be rude, right? So there's a certain emergence of the individual that kind of came out of those times, right? A fair amount of trust in your community was needed and was produced in such environments. A little bit later on, In ancient cities, there was also a sense of commonality. So, for example, here you have a picture of a public restroom in ancient Rome. So the picture, of course, is recent, but the structures are very well preserved. And, you would sit there along with other people, and basically that would be considered a normal thing. There were basins for cleaning up, there were revolving doors. It was all very industrial. So things that we would consider very, very private today would not necessarily be considered such at that time, right? There were public baths, of course. Romans would live in crowded houses with thin walls. Even if you think of ancient Greece, the Greeks used geometry to maximize sunlight but minimize view. So you couldn't really peek into the houses from the outside, and that was also a feature of the architecture. So this was studied already in the 2000s. So if we look at where the word privacy comes from, we might speculate that it comes from the Latin privatio, which means a taking away or a sense of deprivation. And in Latin, it's also interesting to note that there's no word for privacy, and it may come from this word, but we don't have a lot of certainty around that. But I think the main message is that back in the past, the default option was being together. Simply technically, in terms of resources, it was not really possible to do otherwise. And in terms of control, the apparatus of control was not really nearly as developed back then and automated as it is today. So there was a strong and instinctive need for privacy amongst people. Nevertheless, there was much less automated control. It was less problematic, I would say, if our privacy was violated than if it would be today in the digital age. So what does it look like today? Well, if you look at statistics, you would see that over 70% of US adults use at least one social media site, and then 70% of those use Facebook daily. If you look at the distribution of operating systems on smartphones worldwide, then you see that Android and iOS capture almost the entire market, right? And then if you look at, for example, Google Mail, they probably have 25-30% of the market, 2 billion accounts, and then of course on top of that, probably 80% of smartphones are Android, or maybe 70% of smartphones are Android worldwide. So that means also typically a Google account, right? There's very few people who would have an Android phone, but not a Google account. So these statistics, I think, are a decent proxy for privacy, because social media make you post private stuff, and generally, social media and the companies that run them are generally invasive, and they would say, we're going to protect your privacy from other users, and we'll give you the tools to do that, but you have to trust us, right? And that means that we have to give up our data, and we have to kind of trust that third party, the intermediary, to handle that for us. And I think, that's all a problem in our heads, right? Kind of alarm bells are ringing. We've all heard of the scandals and issues, and I think it's not worth repeating this now, but it's just to say that we are all in this ecosystem, right? And today we speak of a data economy. So basically, your data, the data that you share with others, is considered fair game. So if you put it in the system, it's considered fair game. The kind of policies that drive that are very often obfuscated. You need a postgraduate degree in order to be able to read the average privacy policy. This has been also tested in research. And the consent on top of that is given once, but then the purpose of that processing that you consented to would be made to change over time. So it's like the ground is moving from underneath your feet, or the goalposts are moving. And they would say, okay, if you don't like it, don't use our service. Or if you continue to use our services, that means you agree to a privacy policy, and so on. So, considering these abuses, or, the difficulty that we have in controlling our data, the question, I think, would be, why do we accept this stuff that's happening now, right? So we have all the reasons not to accept that, but what is the reason that we accept this? And our privacy obviously is eroding at an astonishing pace. And again, it's not a question of individual privacy even, but more a question of control, even over whole groups. Because if an algorithm learns something about you, even if you don't care and you are able to share that data, it might learn also something about people that are like you, and therefore it would learn something about the whole group, right? And that's the premise of mass data processing in many places today. So we have all the reasons not to do that. If you think about mail, already in the 1700s, it was forbidden for postmen to sort through mail. The employees could not do that. And then at some point, postcards were invented. Maybe that was in the 1900s. they were cheaper, but they were open. So basically, you would write your greetings or write your message on the postcard directly, and of course, they are lighter, they are easier to handle. So that was kind of accepted, but very reluctantly, because it was pointed out that there's an expectation of communication privacy around those topics, right? So it's a paradox, because today it is easier to automate this process with benefit for those who read our mail, but yet we are less opposed to it, right? So again, we have a reason to think about that. Again, if you look at mobile operating systems, so here there's a little table that comes from research in Trinity College that demonstrates which identifiers are sent to which company, and which made either iOS or Android when you turn on the phone, right? And this is sent before you're even logged in. Many of these identifiers are primary keys, so they can identify you very uniquely. And the real name or identity of a person who's using those devices can be known very easily, right? To the OS, to the operating system, but also to the provider that's giving this information. So if all this is available, there's nothing stopping services asking for more and then linking all that data together. Then if we think of major services, like for example Facebook, this is a direct quote from what Mark Zuckerberg wrote to one of his friends, informing them that he had access to lots and lots of information about people from Harvard. And it's almost like to some of these companies, privacy is a joke, right? It is not a serious thing. I'm sure that Mark Zuckerberg since has learned many things about privacy, and since they have improved a lot. Nevertheless, that approach, I think, is something that we would say is very mature, right? And it's probably a good idea to push to have something different, to have something a little bit better. So these messages leaked in 2010. Zuckerberg admittedly regretted sending them and has said, publicly that he shouldn't have done that. But nevertheless, that happened, right? And that leaked to the press. When we think of that, it's an interesting conversation, because the image that you see here on the right of Mark Zuckerberg was also AI generated, like many images in this presentation, also like some of the images that you've seen in the introduction. So we can ask two interesting questions here. First of all, are we protecting the privacy of the artists that created these works and that taught indirectly this AI to generate a picture of Mark Zuckerberg? So you would, I think, all agree that this picture looks quite a bit like Mark Zuckerberg, right? And the second, even more important question is whether Mark Zuckerberg's privacy is protected from the AI, but also from us, right? So we don't have time to dig in that now, but I think these are definitely interesting themes that we could dig in, a little bit more at some other opportunity. Then another quote that you see a little bit at the bottom on the left is from Eric Schmidt, the Google CEO at the time. And he said, if you have something that you don't want anyone to know, maybe you shouldn't be doing it in the first place. So, if I go and have a medical exam, I don't think this is something that I shouldn't be doing. This is for my health, but I certainly wouldn't want anybody else to know anything like that, right? So this is something to consider, right? It's a paradox, and we see that there are not really necessarily very clear answers. And, I perhaps could be seen as complaining about these companies that do that, but it's not just the companies, right? The problem is much more complex. These are governments too. So if you look at, for example, what the European Union is currently discussing with the US, it's a kind of privacy shield 2.0 regulation that would enable data transfers between the US and between Europe again, after it has been invalidated by a privacy activist. And, again, the public is largely absent from that discussion, right? It's almost like we have to beg our MEPs to pay attention to that. And I think that it shouldn't be like that. The future of government is open, and these discussions should definitely take place at another level, hopefully without, stifling business enough. And then, you could go into even a closer circle around you. You could think, okay, how are my friends thinking about privacy? And, many of my friends, for example, would say, I don't have anything to hide, and therefore I don't care, right? Also, my parents would probably say something like that, or, they would be concerned to some extent, but certainly not, enough to make a big move. Some friends made fun of me and would tell me I'm really paranoid, right? Because, for example, I create my email account on a server that, serves encrypted email and so on, right? So certain things that some of us would consider basic hygiene in the digital world, and kind of addressing some of the threats in our threat model, some of these things would be seen as paranoid by, our friends, members of the general public, and so on. So what I want to illustrate by this is that the problem is not really clear cut, right? And there's many ways we can look at that, and privacy invasions or difficulties that relate to digital privacy can come from many different angles at many different levels. So moving on, another interesting case is the case of LastPass, which was an online service that was keeping passwords. So basically, it would encrypt the passwords and would perform some cryptographic transformations. And so you could have your password synced to some server, but they would not know what those passwords necessarily are. And the company that was managing that handled really poorly a technical breach that they've had. Basically, they got hacked, and they said, well, we got hacked. They put out an announcement, and they said, it's okay, your passwords are safe. They didn't take anything. Then a little bit later, they've said, well, you know what? It may have been that they have taken, some of that, right? So maybe you should think of doing something different. But they didn't say it very loudly. And then very recently, basically in January, we learned that that service also lost, or let's say that service basically got hacked by a hacker that could access the backups, right, that you would have, and basically the kind of parent company of that service also got hacked. So instead of announcing that loudly, they basically changed the announcement that they had previously on their webpage, and they called it a day, and they said, you know what, it's okay. So what I'm trying to say is that when we are dealing with situations which require extreme amounts of trust, because I think it would require an extreme amount of trust for me to put all my passwords online in some server, right? Even if they cannot read it, the cryptography is solid, it's still something that potentially could get cracked one day. So if we're dealing with those kinds of situations, and then that trust is abused when there is a problem, then obviously we have to ask ourselves, is that service doing a good job, right? Are we really happy with the way that this is happening? And I think it makes sense for us as consumers to be hard in those cases, and to really crack down on those who think that they can kind of walk around the problem and ignore it without too much difficulty. So this is kind of the middle of the talk. I wanted to just pause for a moment and kind of recollect what we've said already. So the first thing is that generally our expectations of privacy are waning. So we know that privacy is disappearing. In many places it doesn't exist. Many of us are resigned. Many businesses will tell you right up front to get rid of any expectations. The law is such that if you are informed about what's going to be done with your data, then it's pretty much okay, right? You give your consent. I still think it's better than nothing, but unfortunately, again, if you need a postgraduate degree to read a privacy policy, and then if you go to a website and you have to read 700 privacy policies to, access some news, then that's completely, unreasonable, right? It's undoable. We can't do that. If you go, I don't know, to the New York Times and then you read the list of partners, then there really is 700 different privacy policies that you would have to read in order to know what's there. And to understand each of those, you probably need a serious level of comprehension, not only in simple reading of English, but also much more complex topics such as computers, privacy, technology, or even law. So it's difficult to manage that, right? And then our capabilities with respect to this sophistication are relatively low. So we have low capabilities with respect to the problem, and we have low capabilities with respect to our adversaries, right? So the problem itself is becoming very, very complex. And when it comes to our adversaries, in many cases, we don't even know who they are, right? So unless you click several different links and you find out what is the list of advertising partners for a website, you will never know who has access to that data. And these are bits and pieces that kind of keep automatically being collected, but all together they form a picture that can be really, really scary, right? And the knowledge of who's your adversary and what they want is fundamental to building a threat model, which could help you defend yourself, right? So it's difficult, complicated, and unfortunately, we don't have good tools to manage that. So if we don't do anything, what kind of future can we expect under these circumstances? This stuff keeps happening, and yet there is no real change. So we as citizens usually put a low premium on our privacy, and we certainly prime convenience and cost over privacy. So if something's convenient, then it might not be private. We probably will still use it. If it costs money versus something that doesn't, then that option that could be more private, that is costly, is going to be automatically less attractive to us than the other option that is not costly or that is for free, but it invades our privacy, right? So we don't see our data as valuable, and we don't see the consequences of our data being valuable. Any privacy products today, and there are many, are unfortunately niche, right? So even experienced individuals struggle, experienced companies struggle. So what kind of future can we expect when we take that into account? Well, I think the others will tell you quite a bit about artificial intelligence, machine learning, data privacy risks. I just wanted to introduce the kind of high-level setup maybe. First of all, any kind of machine learning setup is going to need data, right? And compute would usually happen off device, so the data goes off device. Then there is inference that is done based on the breadcrumbs that can identify you, your attributes, so you lose control over that information. And then predictions based on others can affect you, right? So this is some kind of profiling. And I think if we're doing, genetic profiling in order to develop better drugs, that makes a lot of sense to us as a society, right? We should not reject that benefit. But the point is that these algorithms create new sensitive information, and that requires from us new ways of protecting that sensitive information, right? We have to think about what new implications are there because the ground keeps moving from underneath our feet. So, there's dystopian stuff. For example, some companies would know about you more than anybody else, right? More than you yourself would even remember. So tomorrow, your insurance, for example, could depend on information that was shared today, unless, of course, that sharing would be somehow prevented or outlawed. You've probably heard of Clearview AI, which is a company that put up maybe 20 billion images for law enforcement use. And they scraped faces from public sources, Facebook and so on. They were not authorized, but basically these were public sources. And again, the same principle applies. If it is out there, it is grabbable, right? So you would be able theoretically to kind of put on virtual reality glasses and you'd have the backstory of every person that you're meeting instantly, right? So through that kind of technology that is already possible today, any kind of public privacy, which we also understand as anonymity, could be eliminated, right? It could be used in military contexts, it could be used in other contexts, and basically, this indiscriminate collection of data, unfortunately, leads to these kind of issues. Some of you may know this episode of the series Black Mirror called Nosedive. So there's a kind of social credit system in real time where basically the main protagonist is using as well, and she's kind of arranging her life in order to conform to the expectations of others. But this is the whole key, right? If we are being observed, then it is proven that we change our behavior. And social credit systems already exist. For example, in China, they have several different pilots that have been running already since quite a few years. And some of them would use AI to determine scores, and an algorithm is secret. And for example, you are found to be jaywalking, crossing the street illegally, and you get an SMS, right, or something like that. Then there are many others. Some are rule-based, some are AI-based, some are centralized, some are hierarchical and multi-level. But the point is there's an incentive mismatch here, right? The incentive of those who observe you is to kind of keep a box, right, to keep a frame. And then your incentive is to feel free and feel unobserved and not to change your behavior, but to kind of to exist in a natural way, right? So the question is, how can we make those meet? And here we are, let's say, in Western Europe discussing our values, but if you ask many of your colleagues from mainland China, many of them might agree that this is a good idea because it drives you towards a safer society. So I think this is something to consider, right? Something to think about. Technology is bringing you to a kind of slightly dystopian point. And then there are extreme cases. For example, they're putting guns on robots. I mean, this is what the headline says, right? And that's what's happening. So I think it's very important to understand, the implications of kind of letting things roll out automatically, right, without us. So what we could say is, well, no, we can do definitely better than that. And I would like to offer 3 suggestions on how we could make it better than that. So the first suggestion would be what I would call bootstrapping. So, many of us may feel negative about this stuff, but we used to care about it and we can care about it again. Money and convenience do rule in today's world, but I think we can learn more. We can bring a message. that comes from our personal learning. So I think the challenge here is for us, with our, let's say, intellectual responsibility. Of course, if we are here, then obviously we perform an intellectual job in one of the Euroforum organizations. And that means that we have the capability to understand many of the implications of this kind of world. So I think it makes sense for us to try to do some work to understand much better what privacy is, educate ourselves, and thank you for coming to this talk. Understand the value of privacy, and obviously this cannot be expressed in 20 minutes. So bootstrapping means learning a little bit more and understanding why it is really important for us on a deep level. The second suggestion I would like to make is for us to be ready to provide explanations. So we can make others care. We can explain why privacy is important. We can preach to friends. We can write to MEPs. We can care about legislation and the law. Again, I'd like to bring the example of Privacy Shield 2.0. I bet Max Schrems cannot wait for it to appear so that he can start picking at it. And again, I think as we are intellectually fit individuals, we have a responsibility to society to process this stuff and to explain it in a way that is digestible, right? And current events show how important the law and its efficient application are. And the future of legitimate governments, as I said before, in my opinion, would be open, especially in a digital world. And then the third suggestion I would like to make is to support friendly technology applied in a privacy-friendly way. This technology exists. It has to be brought to light. It has to be applied responsibly. I think it is up to us, to a large extent, technologists, engineers, scientists, in order to ensure that this happens. I really personally value the fact that Europe is a worldwide leader in this thinking, and I think we have a role to play there as individuals. So what are these technologies? Obviously, open source is one of them. It's not a golden bullet, but it's a necessary step for transparency. So I would encourage you to support that system, support those who work in it, often with no reward and gratitude, and benefit from the transparency that open source provides. It's, again, something necessary, in my opinion. It's not a kind of panacea that will solve all problems. Another set of technologies that is interesting or relevant are privacy-enhancing technologies. So those, I think some of our colleagues will speak about a little bit later. But these are basically technologies that embody fundamental data protection principles by minimizing personal data use, maximizing data security, and third, empowering individuals. So these technologies allow you to, for example, perform machine learning in new ways, either without seeing all the data or ensuring that inputs won't be revealed in the outputs. You can, for example, prove that you're over 21, but you can do that without revealing your real exact age. So all of this is based on modern cryptography. It's a rapidly evolving field. Major companies and universities are doing research in that. And I think it's something very interesting that will be, a kind of mathematical and scientific way for us to ensure that certain data would remain private. A more practical technology that's based on modern developments in cryptography is decentralized identity. Again, it's a technology. It can be applied for good or bad. But the interesting thing about this technology is that it allows you to take control of your data, and you are changing the loop of authentication. So basically, you as a holder of a credential, you receive that credential signed from an issuer, and then presenting it to the verifier, you are able to prove that you really hold that credential, right? So the verifier, the organization that's verifying your credential, does not need to check back to the issuer whether you really are who you say you are. So there's lots and lots of technology around this, many different companies and organizations. There's a big, let's say, one of the protoplasts of this was a company called Sovereign. If you're interested in decentralized identity or decentralized identifiers, you can find a lot of information on the web. And then, one of the most delicate and thorny subjects is money. And money is related to identity. Money is related to technology. And there is a technology called central bank currency that is being investigated by over 100 central banks. And it is a digital form of central bank money that is different from the balances that you would have in traditional reserve or settlement accounts. The difference is it basically would behave like physical cash, but in the digital world. And it's very different from what you might consider as crypto and so on, because there are very good technologies that can be baked in and provide you with the benefits of cash, such as, for example, inclusivity, anonymity, privacy, and so on. And there's lots and lots of countries that work on this. These slides will be uploaded later, so you'll be able to take a look. So thank you very much for listening. It was a pleasure to be here. You know, in the end, we're fighting for an important component of humanity. And I think it makes perfect sense for us to leverage and uphold these values and apply them to new technology, just like we apply them to older technology. So it's been a pleasure to speak about this in this forum, and I give the word to James. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Andrzej. It was a pleasure to listen to you as well. And I very sobering talk and an interesting lesson from antiquity to the future on privacy issues. Yeah, I'm glad that you ended on a little bit upbeat. I mean, I was reminded of an event I was in recently about technology for health, and one of the things that stuck in my head was people saying that in jurisdictions where people are encouraged to use health tracking wearables, and they store the data locally and they choose who they share it with, the uptake is much higher than it is where the data is sent to a central server, which sort of says to me that yes, we're resigned, but we don't really accept this situation, and maybe there is some hope there. I don't know if you want to comment on that before we hand over to questions.
James, I would certainly hope so. I would really like to concur. I think that, you know, when I say we are resigned, it is not an absolute statement, but I think we all agree that there's a feeling that we cannot do much about it. And, you know, even if we take the most experienced security professionals, you know, they have such a wide spectrum of threats like any other human that it is not simply possible as a person to defend against that, right? It is becoming too complex and too automated. And I think that's what we need to think about, but it does not mean at all that the game is lost. I would say on the contrary, I think that there's a huge amount of technology that is out there that we can apply in a responsible way. And that can drive us to a future in which we, the citizens, are a little bit more in control of what we share with whom and how. And I think that's entirely possible.
And let's hope we go there. Okay, Gabby, over to you. I know noticed there were questions coming in.
Yes, we have 3 questions. I would like to start with the first one with regard to the usage of the Pegasus spying system. Andrzej, do you have any comments or remarks? What's your opinion about the system?
So I think that the discussion on Pegasus has taken. I think it's been around for quite some time, and these systems would typically try to inject themselves onto your phone or onto your devices without you knowing anything, and then that program would be applied to spying, for example, on dissidents, on journalists, on enemies of the state, and of course, who the enemy is depends on the state, right? So we can discuss whether that technology is something good or not, but I think that it creates enormous privacy risks and has been proven to drive to very, let's say, difficult, conflicting, and morally questionable situations. So it may be for security, but again, the need for public security cannot override many other types of security that need to be provided to citizens. So I'm not sure I'm answering the question exactly, but it's certainly something that we have to think about.
Yeah, thank you, Andrzej. We have now 2 questions which concern rather, let's say, the practical aspects of data protection. And one of the participants wonders if privacy is possible without users performing their own encryption of information they want to keep private. It seems the average users are not going to encrypt the data themselves. What are we at the mercy of service providers, aren't we?
I think this is a very interesting problem. So it is true that, as regular humans, we are unable to sit down and write a performing operating system for our phones, right? So in a way, we are always dependent on someone. But I think the trick is to demand solutions which remove the intermediary from our chain of trust, right? The trick would be to simply not have to trust anybody. And I think many of these technologies are already being worked on and built in. So, if we take, for example, the case of our parents, I'm sure that they are perfectly capable of setting up an iPhone, which is going to encrypt the data that they have there. Now, that iPhone probably will share that data with the iCloud, which means that others will have access to it. But the point is that there is a technological step that historically has been very complex and has been made very, very easy. So the technology exists, and I think it is up to us to push that technology makes it that first of all it becomes standard that we want it, And secondly, that this technology makes its way into the devices that we use.
I think this now switches naturally to the other question, so the last one, which is here on my list. A person wonders if there is any open source technology that aid data protection and privacy, of course.
Sorry, I don't think I understood the question. Could you rephrase?
Yeah, is there any open source technology that aids data protection and privacy?
I think there's an enormous amount of open source technologies that do that, right? So depends on the threat model that you would have, depends on who is trying to do what to your data, but you can use services such as, for example, mailbox.org, which are kind of promising you that they will encrypt your emails and they will not read them and so on. So you have to trust them. But then there's other technologies such as PGP or signing technologies, which allow you to exchange direct messages with others without anybody else being in the way. And that provides you with cryptography that is, well, in some cases is easy to use. For example, you could pick up the signal communicator and that aids data protection, right? Or there's even technologies from companies like Google that allow you to process data that you may have stored in the Google Cloud, but then you can apply privacy preserving algorithms or machine learning, right? So it's a little bit tricky because again, it depends on who you trust. Of course, to use that technology, you have to trust Google, but then that algorithm may be open source and may be applied on data in a way which will then protect all those that are in your data set.
Thank you, Andrzej. I think we are now at the end of our list of questions, and also I think perfectly in time to switch to the other speakers. Thank you so much.